Hello and welcome! If you are not the first time on my channel, you will probably know that I use the game Doom quite often as stability test and a benchmark on the repaired mainboards and PCs. Well, this game is one of my favorites of all times and I still play it quite often. It was a gem of its time and technologically absolutely mind-blowing, just as the hardware requirements which were defined to be able to enjoy this game. In my videos I often get comments and questions why Doom is running so slowly on the hardware which I presented. Some people remember playing this game on a 386 or even on a 286 and they remember it running silky smooth. Well, I think that our memories sometimes cheat on us, so in this December special I decided to rediscover once again which hardware was really needed to enjoy Doom, and you are welcome to follow me down this road. First of all, why Doom? Why was it so important? Let's start with a little bit of history. Doom was made by the company id Software. Many very creative people were working there, but one person was interested more than the others in not only to make good games, but also to push the technological limits and to squeeze everything out of the hardware. John Carmack introduced with every game something what was impossible before. Let it be Commander Keen, for example, with the free-screen scrolling, Wolfenstein 3D with its raycasting, or the further developed Doom with the binary space partitioning and amazing visual effects, which made most of the other games of the time look obsolete. One common thing among all of those games was the speed. They all were fast-paced games and made only fun when running on a fast hardware. So id Software games tended to have quite high hardware requirements on the day of their release. Unfortunately, I have no original box of Doom, but I found some pictures online. Let's see which requirements the game had officially. 386 or better, 486 recommended, 4 MB of RAM and a VGA graphics card. Well, here we have the first hint. Doom requires at least a 386 CPU. Even if you would have 4 MB of RAM on a 286 back in the days, which would be an incredible and very unrealistic amount of memory, Doom would still not work on that PC, because it simply needs 386 features which a 286 CPU didn't provide. But why do people think that they played Doom on a 286? My guess is that they just mixed Doom with Wolfenstein 3D, which was kind of playable on a faster 286, even if it was not the best platform to play that game. And Doom? Definitely not. So we need at least a 386, right? At least this is what the requirements told us on the box. This here is a 386SX, and this board is something very special for me. My channel crossed recently 25,000 subscribers. Thank you very much, guys. And I think it is a good occasion to share with you something what is more or less the reason why this channel exists at all. This is the original mainboard from my very first PC. Of course, it was upgraded over the years. Now it has 4 MB of RAM and a math coprocessor. But as I got it back then, it had only 1 MB and no coprocessor at all. But there is one very interesting detail about this board which I would love to mention. The computer where this mainboard was installed was sold back then to my father as a 386SX 25 MHz. And it always ran at that speed. The crystal is 50 MHz and it is not socketed as you see. I never touched it. However, if you look closely at the CPU, you will notice that it is a 20 MHz CPU. Someone was even trying to send down the number. So this mainboard is and always was running at 25 MHz absolutely stable, no problems whatsoever. But it always reminds me that my first computer was a scam and I was dealing with overclocked hardware much earlier than I thought. Well, I guess my father wouldn't be so happy about it if he would know it back then. And I guess the money which he paid for the 5 MHz difference was huge. I mean, today it's nothing, but back then it was 25% of performance and quite a lot of money, believe me. Anyway, this mainboard will always be something very special to me, and the fact that it was a scam is a funny part of its history. I always keep it in my room near the table where I work, and it daily reminds me how everything has started. I uploaded the photos together with the original manual and BIOS to the Retro Web project. You can find it under M396B if you are interested. So, back to Doom. It should run on this machine, right? Well, let's check it out. This board has a 386 CPU, it has 4 MB of RAM, perfect. We also will need an IDE controller. This one will do. I'll use it with my usual compact flash cards through an adapter. And now, another very important part, the graphics card. I don't want that the system is limited by the graphics adapter, and believe me, it is absolutely possible here. For that reason, I will use one of the fastest, if not the fastest, VGA card which exists for the ISO slot. Diamond Speedstar VGA, based on the Thanklabs ET4000 and equipped with 1 MB of memory. This card was a generous donation by Chris, one of the viewers of my channel some time ago. He sent it over to me together with some other exciting hardware, which I unfortunately didn't show yet here. But the one or the other part will be definitely a topic for another day. Chris, thank you very much once again. I really appreciate it. And this Diamond Speedstar comes very handy for the experiment today, because it is such a beast. It is not just a fast card, it also remains very stable at heavily overclocked ISO-bus if needed. So let's put everything together and make the first run. I will not go into details for the setup. I tweaked the BIOS as much as possible, got the memory wait timings to 0, turned on slow memory refresh, which brings quite a lot of boost, and this is what I got. Well, the game is running, but the controversial question is, how do I define if it is playable? Today there is that magic 60 FPS mark in average, which tells if a game is well playable or can be only enjoyed with limitations. Well, back in the days, such numbers would be ridiculous. None of the games would run with such a frame rate back then, and players considered much lower numbers as fully playable. But which numbers were that? Well, in case of Doom, the game is limited to 35 FPS, and that is the perfect number to enjoy the game, but as it was released, it was nearly impossible to reach it with the common hardware. So once again, which frame rate can be considered as playable in Doom? I guess it is debatable, and back in the days, for some privileged guys, this game was a fast-paced shooter, where for the others it was a round-based strategy, but both groups considered the game as perfectly playable. However, I played this game hundreds of times through, and I think that I need at least 20 FPS in average to be able to fight the game through to the end. Important is that the higher the difficulty, the more happens on the screen, and you will need more powerful hardware to keep up that 20 FPS. Once again, I'm not talking about running the game and playing the first level on easiest difficulty. This would be possible even with 10 FPS, but I'm talking about a joy playing a fast-paced shooter as it was meant to be played. Doom creators were of course aware of the fact that lots of people will not have a computer which would be able to run the game flawlessly, so they introduced some options to reduce the load. Basically, two options to reduce the resolution in different ways. There is high and low quality on one hand, and if that is not enough, you can reduce the size of the window down to a pose stamp. This should allow to play this game even on a very low-end hardware, but I don't see it as a considerable option. Most Doom benchmark results which you can find online were made in full screen with high quality settings, but today I'd like to find out which hardware was needed to really play this game, and full screen wasn't the setting which most of the people used for playing it back then. Instead, I'd reduce the window so the status bar on the bottom remains visible. This is how the game was usually played, how it was enjoyable, and how I'm going to make my measurements. Back to the 386SX 25 MHz. These are the numbers which I got. And there is not much to say. I made 2 runs with high and low quality and got 2.7, respective 4.5 FPS. I consider it totally unplayable. This CPU was made up to 40 MHz, but even if we would get numbers which would be twice as high, it would be still totally unplayable. And don't forget that I have here a setup with extremely fast VGA card, tweaked BIOS and 4 MB of RAM, which were not very common for a low-end 386SX back then. But why is it so slow? Well, the secret is that a 386SX is not a real 386. It was released after the 386 as a drop-in replacement for the 286. It was made because a real 386 was very expensive for the home use and manufacturers wanted to reuse the old 286 mainboards designs to provide cheaper home PCs. The problem was that the 286 was a 16-bit CPU and the 386 was a 32-bit CPU, so the old mainboards had to be heavily redesigned. Intel then introduced the 386SX, which was a 32-bit CPU internally, but had a 16-bit interface, and so it could be soldered onto the 286 mainboards. So the 386SX had half of the memory bandwidth of the real 386, or 386DX as it was called later. Furthermore, 386DX mainboards usually provided additional external cache, which rarely could be found on the 386SX mainboards. All that cut downs made the 386SX up to 4 times slower than a real 386DX compared clock for clock. And even if the 386SX could theoretically run software which was made for a 386, performance-wise it was basically a 286 in disguise, at least in DOS. So doesn't matter what you have had, a 286 or 386SX, you probably played the same games. The only difference could probably be the graphics card, since many earlier 286 PCs had only EGA, but with VGA they were nearly the same. Time to move on and take a look at a real 386DX. This is quite a fast mainboard, which I really like, not only because of the flexible BIOS and the speed, but also because of the violin key on the chipset. Symphony sounds really mind-blowing, don't you think? Well, this board is equipped with an AMD 386DX 40 MHz CPU, and it is the fastest 386, since Intel made only a 33 MHz version. This board has 128 kilobytes of cache and 8 megabytes RAM. It also allows to overclock the ISA bus, which I got from 8 MHz to 13 MHz. The graphics card is the same Diamond Speedstar, and with all tweaks and tricks in the BIOS, I got Doom to run on the system at following frame rates: 8.5 FPS with high quality setting and 13.7 FPS with low quality. Well, at least with low quality this game starts to approach some respectable values, but they still don't look like something what would make a lot of fun. And remember that we have here a fast mainboard with a lot of BIOS tweaking and a great graphics card. Most of the 386DX from back then would not be able to get to that numbers. Again, the game would run. It would be also possible to play the first 2 levels, but I really can't call it playable. So despite that id Software expected 386 as a minimal required CPU, that was not really a good option. It was enough to start the game, but for playing it you need a 486 as was recommended on the box. So let's give it a try. Here I have a 486 mainboard which will serve us as a testing platform. It is Chain-Tag 486 SCSL, which is based on SIS chipset and supports 5V 486 CPUs. One important feature of the 486 platform was the VESA local bus. As the CPUs got faster, the old 16-bit ISA bus became slowly a bottleneck, and the CPU was held back by the graphics card. Not only was VLB running with 32 bits, it was also driven with the frontside bus of the CPU, so the bandwidth became much higher. And this was a huge benefit for the gaming on the 486 over the 386. For the tests, I let the Diamond Speedstar ISA graphics card to run against the Cirrus Logic CLGD 5428 VLB graphics card. It's not the fastest VLB card, but it is still quite fast, is highly compatible and was widely used back in the days. The CPUs will be a 46DX at 33 MHz, as well as 46DX2 at 66 and 80 MHz with 33 and 40 MHz frontside bus respectively. And here are the results. Once again, I made all the BIOS optimizations I could and I overclocked the ISA bus to 13 MHz instead of 8. These results are now from the runs with high quality only. As you see with the ISA graphics card, the 486DX33 made it already to 12.7 FPS. It is interesting to see how much better the 486 is running against the 386, despite that it runs with 7 MHz lower frequency. This benefit is probably related to the 8 KB of internal CPU cache in the 486, which is a lot faster than the external cache on the board. On the 486DX2 at 66 MHz with the ISA graphics card we are getting 16.6 FPS and at 80 MHz 19.9 FPS. Let's round it up to 20 FPS and we finally managed to get to a playable value. So with a fast ISA graphics card we would need a very fast 486 CPU to get to some playable frame rates. Now what's with VLB? How much performance increase will we get there? Well, with the 486DX33 we still don't get near the 20 FPS, even if it's about 30% faster than with the ISA graphics card. But with the DX266 we already get to 26.4 FPS and at 80 MHz we are skyrocketing at 31.7 FPS. Here you can clearly see how much better the VLB system is running compared to an ISA. At 33 MHz the speed gain is about 20%, and at 66 MHz and 80 MHz it is already at 60%. So when using a VLB graphics card, the required CPU to play Doom more or less smoothly, you will need a 486DX2 at 66 MHz or even 80 MHz if you want that drop of extra. I'm quite sure that a 486DX at 50 MHz FSB would probably also crack the 20 FPS mark and would be also a good option. This is so far the result. If you had an ISA only system, you need a very fast 486DX2 with at least 80 MHz or a VLB system with at least 486DX at 50 MHz. A 386 on the other hand doesn't matter if SX or DX, both were not capable to deliver enjoyable frame rates back then. And back then are important words, because I was talking all the time about the original Doom from 1993. Fortunately, id Software was a great company, and after a while they released the source code of their games. Doom was an exclusion, and one day a project named Fast Doom appeared on the horizon and started to add new features to the game and to try to improve the performance. The original Doom was already heavily optimized by John Carmack, so for the project Fast Doom there wasn't a lot of room for improvements, but still some have been made and another 10% could be squeezed out of the code. It didn't magically made it run on a 386, but the project continued to evolve and introduced many different options, which allowed to control more visual settings and to improve the performance even further. Some options have changed the game too much, like replacing the floor and ceiling with some flat color surface like it was used in Wolfenstein 3D. Others only rendered transparency or shadows differently, but looked still quite decent. Eventually, everyone can play with different values and see what fits, but it is definitely possible to play Fast Doom on a 386DX with sufficient frame rates. I tested here some settings and it was able to get from 8.5 FPS in the original high quality settings up to almost 29 FPS in potato quality. However, everyone has to decide on his own if this is still something what can be considered playable. I still prefer the look of the original game, but I can imagine to play Fast Doom with some little compromises to get another 25% of extra performance. Let's say if you have a 486DX33 and you want to play Doom smoothly, give Fast Doom a try. You will have to find the settings you can live with, but you will be surprised by the result. So this is my experience with Doom on the retro hardware so far. When talking about the games by id Software, here is the rule of thumb, what you will need to really enjoy their games. For Commander Keen you will need a 286, for Wolfenstein 3D you will need a fast 286 or a 386, for Doom you will need a 486, for Quake you will need a Pentium. Of course, faster is better, and if you want to play all of those games without headaches, just get yourself a mid-range Pentium PC. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you once again for helping the channel to grow and reach 25,000 subscribers. Thank you for all of your kind comments, corrections and support. I really appreciate it. And I would be glad to see you here next time again. And so far, thank you and goodbye.